Here I am again for a video that will undoubtedly be joyful as I am back with Inmost from indie studio Hidden Layer Games, this time for an analysis of the soundtrack composed by Alexei Nechayev. As we saw in the first video I made about this game, an analysis of Inmost's different gameplays and narrations, Inmost tells the story of Lizzie, a little girl who seems to be locked in a house with a wrecked couple, a broken woman and an absent man, Astrid and Zach, too distant to be her parents, and who's going to imagine a tale to escape her reality. In this tale, a knight goes in search of pain crystals coerced into this murderous task by a terrifying monster, the Keeper. Safe from the Keeper, however, the knight tries to grow a flower he has stolen. Finally, a third playable character, Adam, also known as the hero or the wanderer, explores an eerie castle and its equally dark surroundings. Of course, different characters evolving in different universes means different musical atmospheres. It's time to analyze the music of Inmost. The soundtrack focuses mainly on the piano, the composer's main instrument, and the orchestra. Both are treated in a more versatile way than one might expect. The orchestra, quite far from transparency, mostly uses the strings, the brass instruments, and the timpani, often associated with the choir and the organ. It is therefore rather massive, spectacular at times, excessive one might say, but a justified excess which never lapses into any form of comedy, as what is told is certainly hard to believe, the knight's universe, a metaphor for a reality that is difficult to fully grasp but proves to be very real. Because of the construction of the game, clearly split into sections and alternating the playable characters, the evolution of the music is not very organic, and the fact that there are many short cutscenes before the long ending involves that there are also many musical gestures, shorter, very spectacular. Whatever the playable character, their universe is violent or at least dangerous. The piano is very versatile given the diversity of its tones, but especially the talent of the composer on this instrument. I will talk about it later. In between the orchestra and the piano, sometimes a much smaller string ensemble is used, notably to accompany the exploration of the house by the little girl, Lizzie. The counterpoint is then more limited and the overall sound is bleaker, a bit hollow. This theme, the inability to express things, can be treated in several ways in the music, notably in the melodic material. One of the main elements is in fact very simple, two descending halftones, B-flat A, D-flat C, which when repeated can create a descending motion, D-flat C, B-flat A, which can also be found as a slightly different motif, F, E-flat, D-flat C. Or its symmetrical form A, B-flat, C, D-flat. Although simple and not very melodic, suggesting as it is a form of caution, of apprehension, even of fear sometimes, this thematic element proves to be recognizable and malleable. It will be slightly modified melodically or rhythmically to adapt to the key or to the current emotion. As a consequence of this silence, the relations between the characters are difficult. Astrid doesn't accept Lizzie's presence, and there's an obvious and permanent break between Astrid and Zach. In Lizzie's imagination, Zach is a knight and Astrid, it would seem, is a monster, an absolutely terrifying creature, the Keeper, to whom the knight, in a somewhat ambivalent way, obeys as he lives to attack creatures in dark dungeons, while hiding from him the fact that there's a flower is taken care of. The music will also underline this key aspect of the story, this time regarding the counterpoint. Often the counterpoint will be difficult, almost impossible, either because there won't really be any, or because the different musical elements, although complementary in appearance, won't always manage to blend in moments of confrontation, when the knight presents himself before the Keeper at the end of the dungeons, or moments of unease. Inmost is a game that deals with things that are too difficult to really express. The music will also succeed in this feat, and this from the beginning of the soundtrack. We already find the elements that will be associated with each of the three characters. The key, B-flat minor, associated with the knight and Adam. It will very rarely change except for Liddy's sequences and the fountain cutscene. The piano, notably for Adam when he's in the castle and part of Liddy's sequences. And of course the orchestra, more spectacular for the knight and the keeper, centered around the strings, the brass instruments and the timpani. This piece immediately shows one of the strengths, in my opinion, of the composer, an extremely versatile piano with precisely chosen tones, immaculate phrasing and a perfectly mastered touch. This is an aspect that I will develop later in the video, but it is of course audible from this first piece, in which the piano, at first timid, will darken, going so far as to evoke a form of tragic destiny. Indeed, we begin cautiously, then the speech intensifies to be completely interrupted by the orchestra, which will often be treated this way, called brutal, an illustration of the physical and psychological violence at work in the game, but also an illustration of fate. In the last part, while the piano emphasizes the fatality I mentioned before, a choir, a male choir, comes in. To show the impossibility of saying certain things, rather than not using the voice at all, Alexei Nechayev used a choir that sings with its mouth closed. It sounds as if they are forcing themselves not to open their mouths, and the counterpoint, translating a speech supposedly richer than if there were only one melodic line, seems to underline that each character in most will be affected by this pain that cannot be expressed, and that their fates are connected. The game begins with another piece, Spark. The work opens with a soft sound which seems to be Celesta in the middle register or something very close to it. I don't know if you can have such a phrasing with Celesta. In any case, we have two important elements. The tone itself, commonly associated with childhood, like music boxes or the glockenspiel, and what is for me very important, the attack. Here it's clearly an instrument with struck blades and even blades struck with a hammer, and when the register is high enough you can hear the attack more than the notes. You can hear this very loudly at the beginning of A Tale About Love, on the piano this time at the end of the soundtrack. The melodic material is then blurred by the omnipresence of the attack, the intended speech is hidden. This piece obviously uses the main thematic element of the game in its ascending form, A, B flat, C, D flat, as a small contrapuntal motif that regularly underlines the melody, which also uses the main thematic element but in a different, more dynamic form, B flat, F, D flat, C. Faster and more fluid arpeggios accompany the creation of the tree by the little spark, but the tree's fatal metamorphosis is underlined by the piano, the celesta disappearing at once, before the orchestra, first the brass instruments, takes over from the piano, which is no longer heard. The same ascending motif is still used, but it is now quite ominous. It seems that the spark has lost control of its creating ability, and the tree is a threat to it, while a castle is now built out of nowhere. In their turn, the brass instruments disappear in favor of the strings, with a more lyrical sound as we see the other spark locked up, while the first one gives up, suffering an almost endless fall. Each instrument seems to chase the other. The piano returns, the night appears. Again, cautious but tinged with a certain apprehension, it gets lost in space while the spark is simply crushed by the night as the last note, the D-flat, disappears in favor of the tonic B-flat, which completely closes the piece, much as the violence of the character. The gameplay of each character having been analyzed in the first video, let's now do the same with their musical elements. The music associated with the little girl, Escape mainly, is in stark contrast to the other two characters. Adam and the Knight's musical elements are primarily in B-flat minor, while the little girl's music seems to be centered around a C-E-G-B 7th chord, which highlights the C-B dissonance, and especially the B-natural contrast with the key of the other sequences. Out of the three characters, this is the one whose adventure is real. There is no knight and Adam isn't really exploring a castle, but there is indeed a little girl feeling and looking abandoned in what is believed to be her own home. As for the instrumentation, the piano, at first alone, is joined by the strings. The counterpoint is rather light in homorhythm since the little girl cannot really leave the house. She is even more terrified by the forest than by the house. Her musical material cannot blossom. Even worse, it rejects all elements associated with childhood, those characteristic elements that we had heard at the beginning of the game in the opening cutscene, the celesta mainly, to only keep suffering. One would expect a high register, we locked in the low and medium register, or a rather piercing high register. It's only a half tone, B-C, repeated again and again, the B being often at the lower octave and played at the same time as the C. It is very blurred. The C tries to escape, but is inexorably taken back, captured again by the low B, like a disturbed breathing or rather a heavy sigh, a sign of anxiety. There is a very confusing effect of acceleration, which doesn't feel organic at all. We start with a 5-4, and then the last note, the C, comes earlier and earlier. The measure shortens, it shifts into 4-4, then in 3-4, but there's a rubato sometimes, so it feels a bit uncertain. The basic tempo is already slow, with a pulse that's difficult to feel. Now it becomes even more impossible to follow. It's anything but anchored. The E, higher, clearer, comes progressively to impose itself while the oppressive half-tone fades away to better come back with the strings, which are going to sort of stifle the piano even more by their dull color, reinforced by the parallel octaves and the rhythm, very ambivalent, relentless, and yet still uncertain. The 5/4 lengthens the measure by 1 beat, almost artificially, and the division here into 4+1, very asymmetrical, makes the first note of the measure almost never-ending in this context, as if the strings represented the suffocating atmosphere that reigns in the house and to which the little girl fears to give in. The strange shortening of the bar is again present. It starts in 5/4 and ends in 4/4. The sudden entrance of the F minor chord feels very strong. The sound in particular is very striking to me. It feels more concrete, closer, almost too much compared to the strings just before, which sound hollower because of the parallel octaves, distant, unreal, but the sound then fades away with the repetition of the little motif that gets lost in a decrescendo, as if it was something you would tell yourself over and over. In each part of this piece, Escape, an element is first stated. It's only an attempt at a melody, a short motif that never manages to develop, which moreover fades away in favor of an even more limited motif that in turn diminishes until it disappears. But this expected silence is interrupted by the return of the strings. The material of the piano changes. The E returns in a motif in octaves, now hammered. It's a short motif that we will hear only in this scene. The different elements do not seem to be able to blend together to form a real counterpoint, like this family, in which Lizzie is an added, unwanted element who can't accept the situation, is not accepted by Astrid, and where Zach is finally very little present. The repetition of the B, very intense, makes this last part always so oppressive. And to reinforce the link with the little girl, there is also the use of the glissando, strange and plaintive. When the night appears at the door, a drone is added. A B flat will emerge, clashing with the B natural that we heard until then. The night imposes himself, his music too, for Lizzie. However, as she explores the house and the family's past, this material will change. Soon enough, the little girl discovers a stuffed rabbit in the cellar. From that moment on, her music changes. It is now a soft piano solo in D-flat major that accompanies her gameplay sequences. With this character, whom she makes talk, she plays hide-and-seek, explores the house or drinks caterpillar tea, made with love, but for that you need harpsichord. This rabbit is an element that makes her stay in the house, whereas right now she would rather leave. It softens her daily life a little, it includes her a little more in the house. The sound of the piano is therefore very soft, almost too soft. The softness of the piano's touch reminds us of the little girl soothing with a rabbit, but it is such a relative, uncertain soothing that this softness, this innocence that had been put aside since the beginning, and that awakens a little in Lizzie, highlights, by contrast, the tragic situation that the little girl and the other characters is facing. Of course, we find the main motif of the work, the two descending halftones. As we are in D-flat major, one note is changed to match the harmonic framework, A-flat instead of the natural A. We still cannot talk about a real melody, but contrary to the way this motif will be treated in Adam's musical elements, which we will see later, here the repetitions are directly connected with the bass in a descending motion. There is less silence, even less and less, which doesn't prevent the speech from finally struggling, stammering, with the almost plaintive repetition of the C D-flat halftone that comes to finish the loop. During one of the sequences, this music is even played on a gramophone. There's a soft vinyl effect and the sound is spatialized. This is probably a diegetic effect, since another element, this time non-diegetic, is added at the end of the sequence, when the little girl falls from the high shelf in the kitchen. An ominous drone which reinforces the coldness of the end of the scene, since Astrid refuses to help Lizzie, who is then left alone with her bloody hand while the rain rushes into the room. We are even invited to a proper tea party, but without spoons, where the harpsichord, at times, seems to imitate the drops of tea falling on the floor. Tea made with love. And a caterpillar. After hearing a noise in the attic, there is no more music. This event will trigger Lizzie's exploring the rest of the house. The tea party has been interrupted. The only musical elements that we will then hear are short and rather spectacular gestures connected to Lizzie's fear. First when something comes knocking at the attic door, then when Astrid threatens her with a knife. The musical gesture becomes Hitchcockian as Astrid implores Lizzie to disappear, only to soften immediately in the image of Astrid's instability and fragility. The piano returns, but the anxiety remains as the young woman paces in front of the door. Astrid hits Lizzie, but the scene isn't finished. The tension cannot fall down yet. Lizzie recreates the angry gesture that Anne had had as a child. Astrid then runs away. After this violent confrontation with Astrid, verbal and physical confrontation, the music goes back to the thematic elements from the beginning. There is no more possible return to a trust, if only fragile, towards those who shelter her. Lizzie focuses on their supposed cruelty. We know indeed that she believes Astrid and Zack guilty of kidnapping children and keeping them locked up in the attic. Lizzie then spends all her energy and her time trying to open the door of the attic. She finally does, but there's nothing there, just a raccoon that immediately escapes. Yet, just as the tension seems to be collapsing, this is the key moment of the game. The rabbit, whom the little girl makes talk, convinces Lizzie that everything starts from the chimney and that it is there that she must go and see. She will then destroy the chimney. The music announces that the three stories are going to unite. It's the first time that the little girl's music is going to be that melodic. The piano, in the high register, very reverberated, it seems that the sound dissolves just as the hope of finding the children disappears, and in an ascending motion, which doesn't happen often in most, will take shape when the stuffed animal points to the chimney, sporting the solo cello that briefly transcends the halftone motif, taking up Sparks' version, changing the rhythm to make the element more melodic in a long solo that also takes up elements from the night, this repeated halftone, here more lyrical with a very nice use of the glissandi or portamenti. This is the only moment when the music of the little girl will evolve for a long time before the solo piano returns, just as she discovers the cellar filled with children's things. The descending half tones return, the rhythm slows down more and more as the little girl is facing this realization, and there is a pedal on the bass, meaning that the lowest note on the piano is always the same, which gives the impression that everything is closed. We are locked up in the music again when the little girl understands that she's locked in the house, that children are, she believes, kidnapped. There is nothing spectacular at this moment, the child is devastated, her distress is more perceptible this way. The knight has multiple interactions. We see him in several types of scenes, the gameplay sequences in the dungeons where the knight almost blindly attacks the creatures in these areas, short cutscenes at the end of the first 2 dungeons when he kills the priest and then the couple, Lidie's parents, and longer ones, some with the keeper, others with the flower, Lidie, when he tries to tame her, as does Zack in the real story. Despite this variety of interactions, the thematic material of the knight remains very consistent, with some variations, of course. The knight is not a real character. He is the imaginary version of a real character, Zack, invented by Lidie as a mechanism to sublimate this odd reality she doesn't understand. He is strongly associated with an explicit narrative, that of the little girl, so I really like the use of plucked strings as the main instrumental element. It reminds me of lyrical poetry, accompanied by the lyre, therefore, but it's not really the lyre here. His gameplay being more dynamic, his musical theme has a determined and rather organic pulse, not too hard, not too fast, that keeps some energy thanks to the rhythm of the 16th notes. The organ adds an almost sinister touch to the theme. The knight is, a priori, a negative character, aggressive towards the creatures of his universe. This instrument is also rather appropriate for the knight's universe, notably this first dungeon, which, without really evoking a church, seems to shelter in its heart an altar where a priest is praying. We have seen in the first video that this is a violent character with a spectacular ability, the grappling hook, a character who will reveal the story, who will leave it to his entitled to more spectacular elements as the dungeon is revealed and as the dungeons come one after another. The organ, not yet too present, the choir, which no longer sings with its mouth closed as the story now unfolds, and the orchestra rather cold, strings, brass instruments and timpani, which will first work as a sort of punctuation and then will take the lead as the violence of the character seems to increase. The knight's own heart has blackened. His musical elements contrast a lot with those of the little girl. He is a way to escape from her dull daily life. In any case, she evolves in a dull universe, and apparently solitary, since she doesn't seem to go to school, her age is uncertain, and her musical elements are indeed dull. However, the knight's story is not independent of the little girl, since it's only a sublimated version of what she is experiencing, and what Zack is experiencing as well. Furthermore, even if the exploration of the dungeons isn't necessarily a goal per se for the knight, discovering the place isn't really important, unlike Lidie, who tries to make this strange house become a bit of her own by exploring it. The dungeons do evolve, showing darker and darker color palettes and a more distressing atmosphere until they are no longer real built places, especially for the 4th dungeon, where there is almost no background. And although the gameplay doesn't change, the story is revealed, and especially the connection with Lidie through the famous 2nd dungeon. Finally, these are sequences systematically accompanied by the narration of the older Lidie. The music must therefore allow the player to pay attention to it. It must sometimes find a balance when it becomes spectacular, or accompany Lidie's anger at other times. The first dungeon introduces the main musical elements of the night, which will be found in most of the dungeons, as well as a short musical gesture at the end when the priest is killed. This character has no apparent link with Leeds' story, is there to show us the cruelty of the night. The second dungeon is important in the narrative as it shows another crime, the murder of Leeds' parents and the theft of the flower, Leeds herself. The initial material from the first dungeon becomes darker, using very low strings, perhaps doubled by brass instruments to give this strange depth, and becomes even more dramatic, using the motif of the two descending half tones, recurrent in the music, to the point of obsession. After the third dungeon, the Keeper finally makes his first appearance. We know his musical material, we have heard it before, those extremely low strings. The night is clearly submitted to him, and the thematic material of the Keeper comes to crush that of the night as a demonstration of this submission. The two elements do not mix at all, no counterpoint results from their confrontation. The plucked strings sometimes escape, but in the end, we only remember these extremely low strings. There is also a mirror effect. The Keeper takes the crystals, then gives one back, and the pattern of the two descending half tones is stated once, then mirrored again, when the Keeper, having retrieved the crystals, is about to throw one at the night. It is after this sequence that we find Lizzie playing hide-and-seek with her little rabbit, while the music is played on the gramophone. The warmth of the sound effect and the innocence of this activity, and the sadness that she can only play hide-and-seek with a stuffed animal, contrasts with the horror of the Keeper and makes the little girl look even more fragile, like the softness of the piano's touch I mentioned earlier in the video. In the fourth dungeon, the situation changes again. This is the most disturbing dungeon of all, the one that doesn't even seem to refer to any place anymore, and it's also where we see how black the knight's heart has become, to the point that his whole body becomes corrupted. But the knight wishes to emancipate himself from the Keeper's domination, and after showing his arm entirely, corrupted by the dark matter found everywhere, tries to live with the crystals he has just collected. That's believing the Keeper quite innocent, and the latter then makes a show of strength. The knight is certainly naive to have believed that he could escape him. Music immediately illustrates this brutality, notably this almost brutal B natural, surprising, because we have long been immersed in the key B flat minor, and the B natural could show that the Keeper will do anything. When the organ and the choir return, they seem to share the player's emotion, the choir, in particular, having a bit of a commentary role, a saddened witness emphasizing the tragic destiny, again, the fate of the knight unable to escape from his role as the Keeper's armed hand. when the knight finds himself alone in the small hiding place where he keeps the stolen flower, we hear the plucked strings that are part of his musical elements, but it is, again, a rather solemn organ which is added. Would it be a recall of the death of the first child, or an illustration of the theft of the flower by the knight, the music then underlining the faults committed by the character? The cello too, and in this part, unlike the keeper, whose musical elements never actually merged with the knight, here it does. The three elements come together. The knight tries to tame the flower with the paint crystals, just as Zack takes care of Lizzie by decorating her room, something to which she is, however, indifferent. The last dungeon is a bit peculiar. It immediately follows Lizzie's discovery of the cellar with all the children's things. It is important from a dramatic point of view because we ask ourselves questions that are similar to Lizzie's, and as the denouement approaches, we fear the worst. So it doesn't use the same material at all. It takes up the menu loop, dark, with notably this repeated E natural. This dungeon also differs from the others by the behavior of the silhouettes that do not attack us any longer and sacrifice themselves by giving the last paint crystals before the knight finally drops his sword. As Adam is a kind of transition between the two other playable characters, his music is too. His main instrument is the piano, his musical motif, arpeggios. Arpeggios that evolve slowly, gently, not so much by the harmony they state as by the great variety of tones, thanks to Alexei Nechaev's wonderful touch on the piano. As an instrumentalist, I am always very attentive to phrasings, and my little musician's brain can't always blossom when it comes to computer-assisted music, with Cubase for instance, because too many elements that are necessary for the choice of phrasing are missing, and if the phrasing is not there, part of the musical speech is lost. But the least we can say is that Alexei Nechaev has a very, very beautiful phrasing on the piano. A little more than 1 year ago, the soundtrack to platformer Unbound Worlds Apart was released, and my favorite moments are, without exception, all the parts played on the piano because they are full of meticulous details of phrasing. In the title track, there's, for example, that micro-silence of articulation after the descending half tone A G sharp at the very beginning. But when the element comes back, there is no need for it anymore because the speech has evolved in the meantime. Welcome to my brain. There's also this crescendo immediately contained. Or that B held just a little bit longer and slightly accentuated at the beginning of the descending motif. It's almost nothing, but it's there. And there's the legato. The touch and the phrasing of the left hand too, this is really beautiful. So I'd apologize 1,000 times to the composer, but when the violin comes in, well, I just want the piano to replace it. Sometimes it's a sudden rhythmic rush that gives an almost improvisational character to the piece, like in Glowing Pass or The Mire. I had fun for a few moments, let's go back to Inmost. The wanderer, Adam, is introduced in a rather mysterious way, sitting on a bench while a strange shape with a threatening gesture stands behind him. But he's very quickly introduced in a flash-forward, or rather the whole game is a flashback, which seems more logical given the narration of Lizzie, older, and Adam, without us necessarily being aware of it, as he's shown as the elderly man coming out of his apartment while Lizzie is narrating the tale of the flowers.
Do you remember? Do you remember it? That tale about flowers? I thought it was a good story. I thought it's sure to have a happy ending. I was wrong. It's a tale about pain. Let me tell you. Again.
The music is very simple and contributes to the balance of the sequence. The gameplay of the old man is limited, to say the least. He takes his coat, puts on his hat, and goes down the stairs. But it allows us to keep playing while Lizzie calls him and reminds him of the tale of her childhood. So our attention is first focused on the story Lizzie is telling, without the gameplay or the music getting in the way. Like the title, Time Passed, the music suggests an imperturbable phenomenon through the presence of a perfectly regular pulse that runs through the entire piece. It also adapts to the narration, to the inflection of Cassandra Lee Morris, at first almost childlike, then softer, but with the anger that underlies the whole sequence, ending however on the image of the flowers, the children, and the hope of those who grew these flowers. Thereafter, the man will explore the castle and its surroundings, a large area divided into several screens, each with its own musical material. There is notably the lower part of the castle, the mines, and the upper part of the castle, the tower, the dungeon. Two musics are specific to other NPCs. Some comic relief is provided by the cartographer and his bassoon harpsichord duet, and the disturbing storyteller is given a very nice bass duduk solo. However, after the exploration of the dungeon and a tragic scene, to which Adam is only the helpless witness, the music of the different screens will be replaced by a kind of funeral march called A Storm is Coming. The first puzzle loop of Adam, the one we hear the most in his own adventure, is this one. We have the first element, the two descending half tones, then come the arpeggios. There are many details that delicately change their phrasing, but it seems a little more improvised, although still very logical given what the game evokes. The changing tones sublimates the cyclical nature of these arpeggios, whose bass changes though, and softens when needed. The speed changes, sometimes one arpeggio is more pronounced, then the following ones will be more rushed, almost too much so, but it makes sense here. There seems to be a combination of perfect mastery of the instrument and improvisation, not in terms of material, but in terms of phrasing, that makes the imperfections not really shocking. The speech of the characters in most is not easy, it isn't controlled. It makes sense that some notes slip a little like words that would escape us. From the moment we really pay attention, we develop a kind of micro-listening, and each detail of the phrasing comes to enrich a simple yet very appropriate musical material, accompanied by the sound design, voluntarily invading but well done and joyful. You can imagine a crow that caws, a blob that screams. That's sweet. It's like a story that you would repeat, but differently because you remember something else, or to foreshadow the end of the game because it is behind you. I also find that this piano loop, more specifically the arpeggio part by its softness, has a more dreamlike aspect than the strings, which suits well the atmosphere of the castle, a place that doesn't really exist, unlike the house. The second part, with the scales, evolves towards something more concrete, notably with the return of this emphatic pulse, a little like in the old Adam scene in his building. All the sound possibilities of the piano are used in inmost in terms of register, the keyboard is used almost in its entirety, as well as in terms of touch or even sound processing, of emotions too, of course, but it's interesting to see that even in the moments of softness, such as Lizzie's hide-and-seek games, or this loop of arpeggios accompanying Adam's exploration, pain is always there, in a direct way or by contrast, when the softness of the touch feels completely opposed to the suffering of the characters, thus accentuating it actually. By way of comparison, Hugh's soundtrack, also featuring the piano, treats it completely differently, using a prepared piano, whose often muffled sound immerses us in an atmosphere that is certainly mysterious at times, but which keeps a certain warmth. The little Hugh uses a color wheel to interact with the world after his mother has become invisible following a failed experiment. She continues to communicate with the son, sending him letters whose reading leavens the transitions between different zones after each color fragment is recovered. The music manages to accompany this somewhat strange, sometimes dangerous world, in which, however, the voice and the writings of Hugh's mother are reassuring for the little boy determined to find her. If the cartographer has a rather pleasant music thanks to the instrumentation and its Simon Says feel, the storyteller is symbolized by an instrument well suited to his obsession for the paint crystals, the duduk, here a bass duduk. The melody, obviously using the famous half tones, is sometimes very ornate, almost hurting, with many grace notes that accompany the suffering, as well as the vibrato so particular of the duduk, performed with a jaw movement that makes it very distinctive, an ornament in its own right in this beautiful and intense melody. If you go in Miss Three's lovely Edana, you will hear duduk and some really pretty one. After the castle, we explore the mines. The atmosphere gets darker because the apprentice cartographer, 3 maps to his credit, Cornifer wouldn't be proud, warned us that they were full of dangers, spiders, and a pack of wolves caught in the web, apparently. It's a kind of drone based on the main motif of the work. However, it is interspersed with more spectacular moments because the already very stressful atmosphere of this place sometimes becomes concrete by the presence of a kind of boss, like this character at the beginning of the game who could attack the little cat or the giant spider. The music in the dungeon, after the long sequence with the cartographer, had already been heard in the lower part of the castle where the cat was locked and in the well. It makes the link with Lydie by the use of strings, again doubled by the piano, and moves away from the aneurism of the arpeggios to a more concrete sadness. However, it is the last part, which we don't hear in the game, at least I don't have it in my gameplay, that takes up this idea of an impossible counterpoint with the superposition of very low strings and a piano using extreme registers, very low and very high, a bit like the first appearance of the Keeper, whose theme crushed that of the Knight, preventing any real counterpoint, any mixing of the speeches. This part of the exploration, the dungeon, contains one of the keys to the story, this painful sequence where Anne commits suicide after being bullied for a long time. It's after this that the world Adam explores, already not very joyful, becomes darker. The color palettes change, the music too. The moon was already visible, but the light blue and pink have disappeared in favor of a dark green under driving rain. The music presents a rhythmic ostinato almost like a funeral march, even the timpani funereal. The main motif is taken up again, but there is no longer the slightest attempt at a melody, especially since the sound is gradually muffled and the motif disappears completely in the second part, making way for a half-tone repeated ad nauseam by the piano over the disturbing rhythm of the timpani. Finally, a last area at the far right of the castle has no music, the area where they meet the little cats. There is, however, the fountain cutscene, illustrating Adam's story, this time his meeting with Zack's mother, the birth of his child, and then the death of his wife. It's a welcome rest both in the game and the soundtrack, a rest that unfortunately doesn't last long. The main key comes back to Lorca's Inn, as well as the piano, as a new illustration of the fate that none of the characters in Inmost seems to be able to escape. At the time of the denouement, the musical elements, notably instrumental, of all the characters will obviously mix, from the moment when Lizzie, after finding the cellar with children's things, will confront the one who brought her here. This ending combines the destinies of all the characters, whether they are real, Lizzie, Astrid, Zack, and Adam, or imaginary. This last part, only made of cutscenes, mixes what's real and what's not, using in particular the knight, the keeper, and the snake, most likely a metaphor of Astrid's wish to join her little Anne, to stage the tragic end of Zack and Astrid. It strangely gives back a very heroic aspect to the knight, who was until now presented as an anti-hero, whose violence seemed blind at first, then a consequence of his submission to the keeper, after Lizzie understood that Zack had never killed her parents and opened up to his affection. This mix between reality and tale will notably be shown through the sound design, which will change in 3 scenes. First, when the snake arrives, after the moment extremely strong when the flower, Lizzie, shatters the barrier she had set up between the knight and herself. During most of the game, the sound design is very realistic, sometimes almost deafening, and rightly so, and then it takes on a completely oniric dimension when the snake appears. The snake has indeed no materiality. It is the pain of the memory of the little Anne, the will to join her. It is what pushes Astrid to kill Zack. That's why it's first the snake that attacks the knight. It then comes back for the actual fight scene. The death of the snake is, I suppose, only Astrid's belief that Zack has accepted Lizzie as his own daughter, and Astrid cannot accept it, as if he had replaced Anne. The second scene is when suddenly the diegetic sound effects all fade away as the keeper kills the knight, stabbing him in the back when he's down and recovering, as always, the pain crystals. Everything disappears, even the wind that we hear, until the murderous gesture of the keeper, leaving only the infinite softness of the piano that gives to this scene a dreamlike aspect again, because we would like to believe that it is not real, an onirism which will allow an absolute contrast with the following scene, where Astrid returns in the devastated house without music, only with the noise of the knife as the young woman collapses. Astrid has indeed killed Zack. A similar but less absolute effect is found during Adam's attack, who is also stabbed by the keeper, but it's here a metaphorical death. He finally frees himself. This is also an element that shows that the keeper is slightly more than just representing Astrid. At that moment she's dead, so the gesture isn't real, but it's indeed related to Zack's death. The characters mix the universes, but also the narrations. Some scenes are purely descriptive, like the fight between the knight and the snake. Others are rather narrative, whether this narration is explicit, when Anne's story is told, or implicit when Zack and Lizzie get closer. One can suppose that this connection is made possible because there's an explanation on Zack's part, or at least Lizzie understands without Zack needing to tell anything, but she gets something. Two rather similar pieces are used to accompany these more narrative moments. These are based on string arpeggios. During the scene when Lizzie and Zack finally get closer, other instruments are added, references to the other characters. There's the organ, the plucked strings, and especially the piano, which brings a very pretty counterpoint, very melodic finally. When the music supports Adam's narration, only the string instruments are left. The story is difficult to tell and follows the death of Zack and Astrid. There is no more night. The story fully revealed, it is time for meditation as Lizzie joins Adam on a bench in the cemetery in front of the graves of Anne, Astrid and Zack. The plucked strings predominant in the night's music in the tale of the flowers are here slow and soft, accompanying the silent reflection of the two characters, the end of a painful story, a moment of recollection. This wasn't a tale about pain, but a tale about love. A bittersweet ending, however, as the piano takes up the motif that runs through Inmost soundtrack in the piece that closes the game. The notes almost blend together thanks to the likely use of a pedal. A pedal noise can be heard shortly afterwards, it seems to me, as a remnant of that pain. Just as we could hear at the beginning with the Celesta, the attack of the hammer also slightly hides the sound of the piano, blurring the speech. Contrary to what we have sometimes heard, here the pulse is clear and settled without being oppressive. The theme of fate has disappeared since Adam was able to save Lizzie, because it is softened by the ascending motion of the left hand and the phrasing, decidedly always exemplary of the composer-performer, who initiates an extremely poignant tension and then releases it slightly before moving on. String ensemble, whose somewhat dull color underline Lizzie's strange daily life in the house, becomes more lively. The violin brings a little light, a light that is certainly relative, rather a vigor perhaps, and the pulse remains until the end. Life has resumed for Lizzie. With Adam's help, she has been able to grow up. The piano returns, but it's however a few notes of duduk, the instrument of the ever-thirsting for pain storyteller, with such a poignant sound and phrasing that conclude the tragic story of Adam, Zack, Astrid, Anne, Lizzie and her parents.